Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for GIA's annual Research on Support for Arts and Culture webinar. My name is Jim McDonald. I'm the Deputy Director and Director of Programs here at Grantmakers in the Arts. Our mission at GIA is to provide leadership and service that advances the use of philanthropic and governmental resources to support the growth of arts and culture. We are fortunate for many years, Foundation Center and the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, NASA, has worked with GIA to share national level data on foundation funding and governmental support to the arts. Reina Mukai is the Knowledge Service Manager at Foundation Center. She has authored numerous reports on trends in the field of philanthropy, including foundation funding for Native American issues and peoples. Ryan Stubbs is NASA's Research Director. He directs NASA's tracking of public funding for the arts and its work as the National Repository for State Arts Agency grant-making data. Both Reina and Ryan wrote articles in the current issue of the GIA Reader about their research. They join us today to discuss these findings and answer your questions on the current state of support for arts and culture. First, a housekeeping note. Throughout the presentation, you can type questions to Reina, Ryan, or both in the rectangular text box at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to get to all of them during the Q&A session at the conclusion of this presentation. Reina will get us started today, so welcome, Reina, and thanks everyone for being here.
Thanks, Jim, and hi everyone, and thank you to GIA for organizing this webinar. So most of you are probably familiar with Foundation Center. We're the leading source of data and information on philanthropy. We collect information on more than 100,000 foundations worldwide, and we also collect comprehensive grants-level information for many of the largest U.S. foundations. And we're expanding our collection more and more internationally as well as domestically. And we use this data to provide a variety of resources to grant seekers, grant makers, and the nonprofit sector as a whole, and produce research reports and advisory on foundation giving trends. My presentation today will focus on trends in foundation funding for arts and culture among a set of the largest U.S. foundations over the last decade. And we'll also look at how arts funding has fared compared to overall giving, and look at the breakdown of funding to various arts fields and also by types of support. So before jumping into findings, I wanted to quickly describe our grant sample that much of this data that I'm presenting on is based on. And the set includes all grants of $10,000 or more awarded by the roughly 1,000 largest U.S. foundations by total giving. And this giving accounts for about half of all foundation giving by U.S. foundations. And the 2014 grant sample includes close to 150,000 grants, totaling nearly $27 billion. And I also wanted to explain how we identify grants for arts and culture funding. So grants are included if they're coded as focusing primarily on the arts, whether that's visual arts, performing arts, benefiting a museum, or arts education. If a grant activity can't be determined by the grant description, or if it doesn't have a grant description, which many grants don't, we revert to the activity of the recipient organization, which is based typically on its mission statement or mission. So I'm going to jump right into the findings here, and this figure shows the share of dollars going to arts and culture between 2004 and 2014. And this tells us how funding for arts has fared compared to other areas such as education and health, human services, social sciences, and other sort of major issue areas that we track. And over the past decade, U.S. foundation funding supporting arts and culture has declined as a share of total foundation giving. At its peak in 2005, arts funding accounted for about 12% of overall dollars, while for the most recent year, 2014, arts accounts for only about 7.5%. of overall dollars. And it's hard to say if there's been a general shift in priorities for funders away from the arts or if there are other factors involved. But the share of number of grants has also declined slightly, but has remained more or less steady for the last several years at around 12%. So this next figure represents the actual dollar amounts awarded by arts and culture by our set of the largest U.S. foundations between 2004 and 2014. And as you can see, giving for the arts has remained relatively steady at around $2 billion and not accounting for inflation. However, if we did account for inflation, so for example, if we adjusted the $2 billion that went to arts and culture in 2006 to 2014 dollars, it would in fact be closer to $2.4 billion, which would indicate that arts funding may not be keeping pace. And the median arts grant has also remained unchanged and stands at $25,000, not accounting for inflation. So the real value of the median grant has also in fact decreased. And to put it in perspective, the median grant size for all giving by our set of large funders was $30,000. So this next figure shows the change in foundation giving by a matched set of funders between 2013 and 2014. If you look at the orange bar on the left, you can see that grant dollars for the arts increased about 4% compared to 10% for overall giving, which is represented by the blue bar. Funding to visual arts and museums had the highest increases in giving among the arts, with about 26% and 17% increases in dollars respectively. And the right bar shows changes in giving to the number of grants for arts and overall. And as you can see, there was a slight decrease in the number of grants awarded to the arts, but it has remained more or less steady between 2013 and 2014. So next I'd like to talk a little bit about the distribution of arts funding by field. So the distribution of arts funding by field has actually remained more or less consistent over the years, although I should note that in prior years, media and communications was always included under our analyses of arts and culture, and in more recent years, we've actually moved away from using the NTE codes, which is the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities, to code our grants data, and started using our own philanthropy classification system, which has moved media and communications into its own separate category. So the largest share of arts funding in 2014 went to museums, which captured about 37% of all arts dollars. And that came out to, I think, roughly $726 million. And the largest museum grant in 2014 was a $31 million award from the Silicon Valley Community Foundation to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Performing arts, which includes everything from dance and theater, music, performing arts education, captured the second largest share of dollars in 2014, accounting for 34% of all arts dollars, or $675 million. So in any given year, these two fields capture the largest shares of arts funding, often alternating from year to year. But the performing arts tends to capture almost double the share of number of grants, as grants awarded to museums tends to be larger on average compared to grants awarded to the performing arts. So next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the distribution of arts funding by types of support, since this is an area of interest to many funders and arts organizations. So this figure shows the breakdown of giving to the arts by support strategy. General operating, program, and capital support account for the largest shares of grant dollars supporting the arts. And compared to giving overall, shares of grant dollars awarded for general support was higher for the arts, so 26% versus 16% for the overall grant dollars. And program support received the second largest share of our grant dollars in 2014. Special programs and projects typically receive one of the largest shares of arts and culture grant dollars. And the same is actually true for most of the other major fields such as health and education, where program support consistently accounts for one of the largest shares of funding. And capital support accounted for the third largest share of arts grant dollars. And similar to general support, the share of grant dollars allocated to capital support was higher for arts and culture compared to overall giving, about 19% versus 8%, which makes sense since some of the largest art grants in 2014 were for arts acquisitions, endowments, buildings and renovations, all of which were included under capital support. And grants for capital support do tend to be larger on average compared to other types of support, and exceptionally large grants can have a pronounced effect on the distribution of funding by support strategy. So this is the last slide, and it actually looks at all U.S. foundation giving from 2004 to 2015. And as you can see, aside from a slight dip in 2009 because of the economic recession, foundation funding overall has increased pretty steadily. And in 2014, giving by the approximately 87,000 private and community foundations rose 9% and continued to grow in 2015. And similarly, among the 1,000 largest U.S. foundations included in the 2014 grant set, overall giving was up 10%, as you may recall from one of the previous slides, while arts and culture funding grew at a more modest rate of 4%. So while actual grant dollars in 2014 were higher and arts and culture continued to rank among the top funding priorities of foundations, the share of overall foundation support targeting arts and culture remains smaller than what was reported even back in the early 2000s and earlier. So actual arts grant dollars are likely to grow with overall foundation giving. But what remains unclear is whether arts funding will rebound to its earlier share of overall foundation support. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan to talk about public funding for the arts. So thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Reina, and hello to everyone. Happy to be here today and to once again discuss the latest information on public funding for the arts. I'm Ryan Stubbs, Research Director at the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. We just heard about foundation funding, and my role here is to focus on data trends in public funding and grant making. As I'm sure we all know, the role of government funding for the arts has been at the forefront of the public discourse, and we won't shy away from that discussion. I'll start with the latest trends as published in the GIA Reader. I'll give a few updates on the most recent data, and I'll speak to the important roles of public funding and grant making, including the vital role of the National Endowment for the Arts. So first, let's talk about the facts. Who are the government funders? How much do we spend on the arts? And how has this trended over time? Public funding for the arts is best understood by tracking three sources: congressional allocations to the NEA, legislative appropriations to the nation's state arts agencies, and funds allocated by local governments to local arts agencies. Over the course of this presentation, I'll reference appropriations to the NEA, and that's the total budget that Congress approves for the NEA. We'll talk a lot about legislative appropriations to state arts agencies, and these data are collected by NASA twice a year through our State Arts Agency Revenue Survey. This includes state-appropriated dollars only, so no federal or private funds are included within the state funds. And the same goes true for local funds. The third layer is local funding. This information has recently been improved and updated by Americans for the Arts, and we'll be looking at the total figures for local government dollars going to local arts agencies as captured by AFTA's Local Arts Agency Census. So this first chart shows the combined federal, state, and local appropriations for the arts from 1996 to 2016. The blue bars at the top show that the local arts agencies hold the lion's share of public funding. In fiscal year 2016, these expenditures were reported at $795 million. The next largest share in red comes from state legislative appropriations, reported at $341 million in 2016, and the NEA's $148 million appropriation is shown on the bottom in purple. We also see here that the mix of funding has been pretty consistent for a long time, with those percentage allocations changing some over the years, but not really a whole lot. And if you add up all three streams, federal, state, and local governments appropriated a combined $1.28 billion to the arts in fiscal year 2016. Now, $1.28 billion is a lot of money, but if we think about that number in terms of total government spending, or we put it into historical context or an economic context, $1.28 billion becomes very small when you change your perspective. For example, let's try to compare how total government spending compares to spending of governments on the arts. So visualizing the amount of government spending on the arts versus total government spending is actually really difficult, because it's hard to find a way to show the percentage relationship that can even be seen by the naked eye. For example, you're probably having a hard time seeing the tiny sliver on this pie chart, but I assure you it's there. This pie chart represents all government expenditures, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis estimates total expenditures at all levels of government to be around $6.3 trillion in 2016. So government art spending, as we've just showed it, is about 0.02% of that. And lately there have been attempts in the media to put this into context. The New York Times has a great way of showing it, which is difficult to put in a slide, but it was many lines of periods following a sentence, and we'd have to scroll down the page quite a ways before learning that a single period represented total federal cultural spending. And actually, NEA funding would be about 20% of that final period. And just a few notes on the breakdown by level. At the national level, the NEA budget represents about 1/4000th of 1% of all federal spending. That's 0.004%. It's hard to imagine how small of a percentage that is. The percentage is also small at the state level. General fund expenditures, which don't include things like capital outlays or debt service, for all states, topped $804 billion in 2016. The share going to state arts agencies was 0.041%. Now let's move on to the latest trends. The gray area on the right of this line chart highlights the time period between fiscal year 2015 and 2016, where overall public funds continued to increase following the recession. First, government support for local arts agency funding increased by 7.7% between 2015 and 2016. Before 2012, these revenues had decreased for 5 consecutive years. But now, we see 20-year highs for nominal local government support. State funding for the arts declined in 2016, decreasing by about 2.8%. But between 1992 and 2001, state appropriations for the arts more than doubled to reach an all-time high of $450 million. But since then, state arts agencies have lost more than 24% of their funds. And we can see here that unlike local arts funding, state arts funds did not quite rebound all the way between the two recessions. The NEA appropriation slightly increased this year with congressional budget agreements taking place before the election. As of now, funding for both the remainder of fiscal year 2017 and fiscal year 2018 have yet to be resolved. The current continuing resolution extends funding for operations of federal agencies, programs, and services until April 28, 2017, this year. Congress will first need to come to an agreement for funding the government through the current fiscal year, which ends September 30th. Once this is resolved, Congress will then begin the long debate over fiscal year 2018 federal spending. This includes the debate over the President's proposed budget. Now, overall, looking at the trends, years of continuing resolutions for the government have led to relatively unchanged appropriations for the NEA. There is a dip in fiscal year 2013 caused by cuts known as sequestration, and over time the NEA has been the smallest but most steady piece of the public funding mix. Now this chart gives you a better sense of how much inflation diminishes the power of a dollar. We see that all levels are lower than they were 20 years ago after accounting for inflation. When we think about the implications for the sector, we know that there are a lot of struggling organizations out there, and the cost of doing business is rising. If public funding isn't at least rising with inflation, that means a more difficult environment for artists and arts organizations. And another contextual indicator that I wanted to touch on is per capita funding. Combined, NEA state and local arts funding yields a per capita investment of $3.95 per person. This per capita calculation is an important measure of public funding because the money originates from all taxpayers and it's meant to benefit all citizens. So the number of communities and individuals public funding can reach is important to consider. As population grows, public arts agencies need to serve more people. So consistent budget growth is necessary not only to keep up with inflation, but also a growing nation. This chart shows that per capita funding has actually declined as populations have grown. And I wanted to provide an update on state arts agency funding, given this is the funding stream tracked most closely by NASA. This chart is from our fiscal year 2017 State Arts Agency Revenues Report, and we show an 8% increase in state arts agency revenues for fiscal year 2017. So what we saw in 2016 may be a temporary dip, and revenues have again gone back up above pre-recession levels. We are now monitoring state legislative sessions which will determine fiscal year 2018 budgets. While it's too early to guess about 2018, I can say that state arts agencies face very tough funding environments and state governments remain under great fiscal pressure. So now that we've laid the groundwork of public funding for the arts, I wanted to talk about ways in which the different levels of government funders are interconnected, including the NEA. The NEA, state arts agencies, and local arts agencies are all connected with real dollars. 40% of the NEA program budget goes to state arts agencies, and about 15% of state arts agency grants go to local arts agencies. But those partnerships and those dollars are matched at every level, leveraging many more funds and creating an intricate system of support for the arts in the United States. Now this schematic attempts to illustrate how resources and knowledge move throughout the system. At each level, government funds go directly to arts organizations and artists. Those funds are then matched by private and other funds at each level. Additionally, the 40% of NEA partnership agreements going to state arts agencies are then re-granted to many different types of institutions, and subsequent re-grants with these funds are also made at the local level. But another important part of the leadership role that the NEA plays in building the sector in terms of knowledge and programs. Through leadership and priorities, this filters through every level. The main point here is that the combined efforts of different public funders build on each other in a way that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. An example using data here, state arts agency data, is that we know that a $50 million investment of the NEA is then garnered with $340 million in state arts agency investments. And these projects also get $350 million in in-kind support. And this all is leveraged with $3.7 billion in additional local and private support. So the combination of public funding streams leverages billions of dollars in additional investments. NEA funding is a vital part of this leveraging equation. We know that NEA-funded projects are matched 9-to-1, and the matching requirement for most public grants are at least 1-to-1. So no matter how you cut it, the NEA is foundational to the arts ecosystem. So the previous data showed that the NEA plays a very significant role in the arts ecosystem. But now let's explore the data behind some of the grants and programs funded by taxpayers. As I mentioned, NEA programs are not only important from a funding perspective, but also from a leadership perspective. As just one example, the NEA's Creative Forces Initiative has worked in collaboration with state and local agencies and provided an important framework to proliferate arts in military work. It's also important to talk about where public funds go. Government funding for the arts don't go to bureaucrats or coastal elites. They go to artists, communities, and kids from a wide range of backgrounds. Funding underserved communities is actually foundational to how the government serves the public. Public dollars don't only follow large cultural institutions, they prioritize communities that need them the most. For example, state arts agencies invest heavily in rural areas. 40% of NEA grants take place in high poverty neighborhoods. 36% of NEA grants go to organizations that reach underserved populations, such as individuals with disabilities. We also know that from the local arts census, that 40% of local arts agency grants require the grantee to demonstrate diversity. So taking a look at the data with which NASA works most closely, we gain a few more insights about who benefits from public funds. The majority of state arts agency awards go to less affluent areas. For example, 54% of state arts agency awards go to counties with median incomes below the state median income. Again, data show that public funding for the arts does not only benefit the wealthy. When compared to the population, state arts agencies invest more in places that need it the most. This chart shows that lower income counties receive a greater portion of awards, and very few awards go to high income counties. And a giant part of these investments benefit kids and arts education. $75 million and 42% of all state arts agency awards are primarily for arts education. 50% of NEA arts education awardees are in high poverty neighborhoods. We also know that local arts agencies from the local arts census, that 82% of local arts agencies are active grant makers in arts education. So I also wanted to point out a few differences of the roles for arts funders. One thing we know from these data is that public funders strategically invest in many more small awards. The median state arts agency award is $4,400, so a very small median award size. Another important point here is that public funders can't fill this gap. From this webinar, we know that the top 1,000 foundations contribute about $2 billion to the arts, and governments contribute about $1.3 billion. So one of those funding streams doesn't work without the other, and all of those dollars are absolutely vital. So as we move forward, both governments and philanthropy face weighty decisions regarding social investments. It is clear that a federal partner in the arts is an essential piece to do the real work of building a better United States. And I'll finish with just a few more resources. You can see here the NEA has a ton of great resources and fact sheets describing all of their investments by discipline and by category. You can go to our website, nasa-arts.org, for all the information that you could possibly want on state arts agency grant making information. And also wanted to point out information is available for local arts agencies through Americans for the Arts, especially the information about the local arts agency census. And with that, I will hand it over to Jim.
Great. Thank you much, Ryan and Reina. I really appreciate it. Really fascinating numbers there of both private decreasing as percentage, as we just saw, and then public increasing, but obviously in a very different climate in this coming year. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. So thank you again, both of you, for your presentation. We'll start now with the question and answers. Just a reminder to ask your questions in the rectangular box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll do my best I can to get to some of those. A couple things right off the bat. One question came in, and I'll address this later also. Will the slides be available after the webinar? Yes, they are. Right after the webinar, you can look at all the slides, and then we will send a link out actually to everyone who's registered for the webinar in the next day or two, where you can have access to it again. So I want to, Ryan, go back to you right away, and you did a great job talking about the impact of all collectively, the public funding, but the NEA, and you definitely showed how it impacts the rural and underserved areas. But I wonder if you want to expand a little more on that, especially given the climate we're in this year, on the importance of that NEA money coming into the states and then the states needing to match that, and what that means for some of the states that you guys serve, and what that federal money coming in and that match. If you want to just expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, certainly. So all state arts agencies receive partnership funds from the NEA, and smaller budget states, which tend to be more rural and have lower populations, are more effective or have a larger percentage of their budget going to the NEA, or are coming from the NEA, right? So for every state, a lot of good is done with those federal dollars. And in some of the smaller population states, those federal dollars are absolutely essential. So when we talk about the distribution of NEA funds and how they have higher impact in more rural and low population areas, that's very real as it translates through what state arts agencies are able to do with NEA dollars.
Great, thank you. And Ryan, one other question. This is a follow-up, and I'm not sure if this is answered by you or maybe the link to AFTA's local research, but someone asked if we can give an example of local appropriations. Can you give an example of local appropriations? Any thoughts on that other than linking them to the AFTA website with obviously significant data there?
Yeah, I would definitely take a closer look at all of the great data that's available in the local arts agency census through AFTA's website. The local appropriations that I was citing in this report are dollars that go from local governments, meaning municipalities and counties, other forms of local governments, to local arts agencies. And those figures were collected by Americans Through the Arts through a survey method.
And that survey is something they haven't done in several years, and so it's a terrific resource. So we're glad AFTA did that. Reina, going to you, there was a question on the slide about support by discipline, museum, performing, etc. And they wanted to know if the categories included arts education efforts in each of those disciplines, or is this presenting performance money? Do you know that?
It does not have an education component for each of the disciplines. We do capture performing arts education under performing arts, and we also have sort of a more general arts education category as a subcategory for arts under arts services, but those are the only two. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does. And is that the arts education under performing, is that reflected anywhere? I'm trying to flip through in any of your text.
The performing arts education is under arts education, but I'm sorry, under performing arts, but the arts education sort of general category is under arts services, and I'm just looking to see if in the snapshot we have like a further breakdown of arts, and I don't think we do actually in there, but it would probably be in this, as far as the pie chart is concerned, would be captured under other arts.
Other arts, okay. Thank you. And then Reina,
but we haven't,
go.
Yes, but we have been actually talking, sure.
No, go right ahead.
Another thing I just wanted to mention is, we've been talking more about, in the beginning of this presentation I had said that the way that we capture arts and culture grants is taking those grants that are, primarily sort of coded for arts and culture, but we've had some internal discussions within our organizations, and we sort of feel more and more that we may, even for like our standard sort of subject tables, start to actually look across all activities. Because sometimes, the way our grants coding process works is we'll look at a grant and look at the grant description, and you can actually code up to, 5, even 10 potential activities that, of that grant. And, in this analysis, we're looking at the primary code. So only those grants that, had a primary code of arts was included in the snapshot. But I think in some cases, more and more we're seeing, maybe we should include some grants as well where the secondary code is arts. So, in some cases, and I give this example a lot, which isn't an arts example, but for example, like a medical research grant or something like that could also be health and education, but somebody has to make the decision to decide whether that goes to health or to education. And sometimes, depending on who's looking at the grant, it's really kind of a, a subjective call. So, but something to come in the future, just to let you know.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So another question for you,
Sure.
Reina, is can you share the definition of art multi-purpose on the slide where it's broken out by discipline? What's under multi-purpose?
Okay, so there's a number of different categories. So it includes like folk arts and public arts and cultural awareness. Oh, I'm sorry. That's other. I apologize about that. Multi-purpose. You know what? Let me just pull up this definition. And I think this is the second year I think we're using the philanthropy classification system. In past reports, we've always used the NTE code. So I myself are still learning all the various codes of our new classification system. So I apologize. But so one of the main categories under multi-purpose would be art services. So like arts councils, artist services, arts administration, arts education, and that general category where something may not have been specified, but it's going to an arts and culture grant.
Okay, great. Here's an interesting question, Ryan, for you, and it's coming out of Colorado where they have the SCFD funds, which are a taxing district. Mm-hmm. 1/10 of 1%, if I'm correct on that, which represented $56 million in 2017. Does that number get included in the report of government funding?
That's a really good question. I do believe that it is included, or that organization is one of the organizations that receives the survey from Americans for the Arts. So, sorry, I don't work as closely with the local arts agency data, so I can't give a definitive answer here. But as far as the capture is concerned, it's a census of all local arts agencies. So funding, government funding, including the SCFD or tax districts going to those local arts agencies should be included.
Should be, okay. And, one thing that pops in my head is Minnesota, because there's a statewide tax. Do you know if that comes into play in the Minnesota number?
Yeah, it definitely comes into play, and something that goes into the state arts agency numbers, right? So as part of Minnesota's legislative appropriation, a large chunk of that, not all of it, but a large chunk of it comes from the Legacy Amendment. So dedicated revenue streams, such as the Legacy Amendment, that go through state arts agency budgets are all captured within our data.
Great, thank you. So in the slide showing grant dollars by support strategy, is general support referring to general operating support as in unrestricted funding? That is correct. Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
And then, Reina, one question also is, we saw from your presentation that the there's been a decline in the number of grants given besides the percentage of the overall going down. I'm curious if that decline in number is true in other sectors also, or is it just the arts and culture sector that see the number of grants going down, or is that a trend across sectors?
And you're referring to the 1% that you saw in the
Yeah,
match set? Or for the overall? It's, you know, I wouldn't say that it's a trend. I mean, it may just be something for this year, but we did see for the overall set as well that the the number of grants was down. So, you know, it's hard to say if funders were just awarding sort of larger grants, but fewer grants. But it's only, you know, one year to another, so it's really hard to say.
Great. And then another question here, and I don't know we can answer this, but I'll put it out there. But it says, what do the NEA funding cuts portend for funding from other institutional funders? Can you offer strategy to arts organizations in approaching them, given this challenging climate? Reina or Ryan, you're welcome to try to answer that, or you know, I think I can say from what we're seeing at GIA is it is a day by day and seeing, you know, what's happening and also what will ultimately happen with the NEA, which we won't know for some time. But any thoughts on that, either of you?
Sure,
I mean, I can only add.
Sure.
Ryan, actually, go ahead, please.
Right. So I think, you know, when we are talking about the dollars that the NEA leverages, right? So the leadership role that the NEA plays in for an arts organization receiving an NEA award is such a, you know, a huge deal for that organization to be able to go out and raise further funds. So I guess I would just say that it's everybody's role to be an advocate for the NEA because it those funds will affect the system at large.
Thank you. Reina, do you have anything to add?
I was just going to say it will be interesting if, in fact, it does get cut to see if, you know, private funding will actually try to make up for that gap if in fact, it happens at all. But, you know, we've seen cases where I think foundations have stepped in, you know, in cases with, like, the economic depression, and it'll just be interesting to see if funders would be funding more, let's say, if there's that gap in funding.
And then back to you, Reina. Any thoughts on, you know, the one thing that it just strikes me every year is that median grant size hasn't changed, and I think it hasn't changed since the late 90s when we checked this. Any thoughts on that related to the arts and culture field and also the other sectors where you said I think the median was 30,000, again, not including you know, inflation. Any thoughts around that and what you're seeing there?
Right. You know, I'll have to look to see if the overall median grant has also stayed at that 30,000, and I think it's actually since the early 1990s that 25,000 has also remained consistent, so even earlier than the late 90s. I mean, there are some fields certainly that has increased in median size, I think, like environment and health, but I will say that when you look at the average, which, you know, we tend not to look at, I think certainly arts grants has definitely increased, and it continually increases, but yeah, I think we'd have to look a little bit closer to see really why
I just think it's important for funders to understand that hasn't changed, and it truthfully has gone down, obviously, with inflation. So, so a question about, and I would have to look back at the slide here, but can the amount of money that is allocated for capital directly related to the support of museums and visual arts, or is there a case to be made for increased capital supports happening in other arts organizations as well? So I guess the question is, do you know how that capital support is actually divvied out within those specific areas?
I don't have that information in front of me, but certainly we can break it out, and if people are interested, we can, I can send you something, Jim, and you can respond to that question directly. But it wouldn't necessarily be only for museums and visual arts. It would be allocated to other areas as well. I think museums is probably a big one because, museums tend to get like large endowments or, for a wing or, arts acquisition, and those were kind of the examples I gave for like the large capital grants. But I mean, certainly a smaller arts organization could get funding for, like an endowment or something like that, or for equipment, or even land acquisition. And those wouldn't be specifically just for museums or visual arts.
Those types getting significant grants also. Yeah, if you want to give me that, I can definitely give it to the person who wrote that question.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to do a couple more. One is, do we have a sense of how much of foundation support in the $2 billion a year was project-based versus general operating? And if so, how has that changed over time or not? I can say one thing, and then Reina, you can follow up, but we know that general operating support from foundations to orgs has increased in the arts, which is great, over the last several years, and actually I believe it's higher in the arts than many of the other areas. But Reina, do you want to follow up?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. So I think general support for the arts is definitely higher than for other areas and has been trending up. As far as the project base, so that would be sort of the program development, I was looking at last year's report, and, compared to last year, it has gone down, but I think it partially has to do with actually our new taxonomy, and there were some things that were being captured under program support in our prior taxonomy that has been broken out, and so it's hard to follow that trend from, previous GIA snapshots to this year. But maybe that's also something that I can look at, and
that'd be great. That'd be great. So yeah, and what you've hit on several times is that the Foundation Center last year started this new taxonomy and using this new taxonomy. So it's really shifted. And for the GIA snapshot a year ago is the first time we published with the new taxonomy, and then this is the second year. And there's an explanation both at the beginning of Reina's report this year in the reader, but also fall of 15, there was a piece by then Stephen Lawrence at Foundation Center explaining the change in the taxonomy, that for you people who really get into that, you might want to read it. So a couple things, we have a little bit of time still. I wanted to go back to Ryan, and more of a subjective answer here of, what are you feeling from your state agencies out there as they're looking towards 2018 and this year? I'm just kind of curious if you can share with the rest of the folks on the webinar what the feeling is. I mean, these are uncertain times, and I'm just curious.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we are tracking what's going on in current legislative sessions. I think that there are certainly budget pressures that are around that state arts agencies are dealing with. We have been starting to track some government budgets, and we're actually going to put out a survey here really soon to get a better idea of what's happening in the current year. Overall, the sense is caution, right? We see, state arts agencies have been dealing with difficult funding environments for a long time now. I think every year that we give this report, it's the same scenario, that there are stresses on all sectors of government, and that also affects what the arts can do at the state level. But the state arts agencies have also been really effective advocates for their agencies in tough funding environments. So I think there's some cautious optimism that those advocacy efforts will pay forward going into yet another difficult year. So that's the sense that I have right now. I can't really give a sense of whether or not funding will be going up or down. We know that there's been one threat of consolidation for the Mississippi Arts Commission, but that was thwarted, so an advocacy win there. And we'll see more over the next few months.
Great, thanks, Ryan. It's going to be an interesting year. One last question that just popped in, and Reina, this is for you. On the slide showing foundation dollar distribution as 26% of dollars go to general operating, 21 go to programs, 19 go to capital and infrastructure, what does the other 34% go to?
So, you know, if you have the GIA snapshot, it kind of, in Table 1, it provides like the distribution of arts grants by support strategy, and it kind of gives the full table. But another large area that arts funding went to as far as support strategy was financial sustainability, which includes subcategories like annual campaigns, debt reduction, emergency funds, sponsorships, and other financial sustainability. There's also, not quite as large, but there's things like leadership and professional development, network building and collaboration, let's see, research and evaluation, and like individual development and student aid. Those seem to be sort of like the major categories where there was some, you know, arts funding.
Thank you, and I'll touch on that, the reader, in a second here. But I'm going to start wrapping up, coming to the end of our session. But before we go, I want to thank Ryan and Reina for joining us and sharing their important research with the field. And as Reina just mentioned, the snapshot is in the current reader, both Reina and Ryan's piece, and the reader is online. You can go to, it's not embargoed. Someone asked if this is embargoed information. It's not at all. It's online. You go to our homepage. There's a button on the far right that says GIA Reader. Click on that, and you can have access to those articles, to both those snapshots. And you also, there's an entire archive of readers. So you can go back, if you'd like, and look at these reports from previous years, for many previous years, because these guys have been great partners with GIA. So thank you again, Ryan and Reina. So today's presentation has been recorded. GIA will be sending you a link, those of you who registered, a link to that file in the next, with the presentation slides within the next day or two. We'll also be sending a brief survey. We hope you'll take a few minutes to fill out. We always appreciate your feedback. Steve, who's our greatest webmaster, knowledge master here, has just made the slides available to you guys, so you can all flip through them for the next couple hours to check them out again, and then you'll get that link. So thank you, everybody who attended. We had great attendance today, and thank you again to Ryan and Reina, and have a great afternoon, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Jim. Bye-bye.
Thank you.